For those who have been keeping up on their mindfulness practices, you will notice that we've rearranged the room. So, let us know what you think. Yes, we're looking for feedback. We'd like it, but just let us know. So, happy Easter. Happy Easter, happy spring. I'm so glad to see you. Welcome. So, all over the world, Christians are celebrating today as Resurrection Sunday. They are proclaiming that Christ the Lord is risen. They're singing, Christ the Lord is risen indeed, Alleluia. Now, many celebrate what they believe to be, or what they understand to be, a physical resurrection. Jesus died. He spent Saturday in the tomb. On Sunday, they went to the tomb. The women went to the tomb. The stone was rolled aside, and the body was just not there. That is the story that many are celebrating today. By his death, physical resurrection, and later ascension, Jesus basically atoned for our sins and guaranteed us eternal life if we believe. That was the story that many of us were told coming up, and it's the scenario that is being preached in many pulpits today. What I would like to do here is give a little bit of a different version of it. In New Thought, we talk about the resurrection, as you know, from a metaphysical perspective. What we do on Easter is we celebrate transformation and renewal and rebirth of the Christ consciousness in us. Isn't that what we do? And it's an Easter that we can celebrate every day. We don't celebrate necessarily a physical resurrection. We view it as a resurrection of God in us, every day and all the time. And that is surely something to celebrate. As Charles Fillmore says, the resurrection takes place in us every time we rise to Jesus' realization of the perpetual indwelling life that is connecting us to the Father. This is a power that is always with us. It's always present. It's always accessible. We just need to breathe and connect and know that it is there. So today, what I wanted to do was take a little bit of a different look at the resurrection, one that is rooted more in the actual history of the event. Not so much a metaphysical perspective, but one that is created due to a different interpretation of the facts surrounding the resurrection as we know them itself. So, are any of you familiar with Bishop John Shelby Spong, who was the author of our reading today? I am a huge fan of Shelby Spong. He is a progressive, a biblical scholar, theologian, and author. And for many years, he was the bishop of Newark, New Jersey. He's now retired. But for many years, he has been a voice in the mainline Protestant Christianity for a new view of Jesus' life and of the Bible as a messenger of inclusion, acceptance, and God's love. For those of you who follow the path of gay rights over the past several years, Bishop Spong has been a loud voice advocating the inclusion of gays and lesbians in every aspect of church life, because that's what he saw Jesus' message to be, and that's what he saw the message of the Bible to be. I am a huge fan of Shelby Spong, and I'm going to be talking about his book today. Actually, a couple of his books. For Bishop Spong and for many Christians, Easter remains the pivotal moment within the Christian belief system. As he writes, the moment of Easter is the watershed for Christians. The whole structure of the church, its faith, and its belief hangs here. If there is no eternal, unshakable, life-giving truths behind the words that purport to describe the moment of Easter, then Christianity collapses into a pious hope, a false dream, and even a cruel delusion. So even somebody who is on the progressive side of Christianity says, if there is no truth to Easter, then I don't know what I'm believing. So that's what we want to talk about. He has spent many years trying to deliver the Bible from the literalism that he sees basically as its death knell, as the reason so many modern readers turn away from it. And we see that here. And we see that in New Thought communities many times. There are people who, I can say, the Buddha said X, and they'll say, oh, that's so wise. And then I can say, Jesus said the same X. And it'll be, well, I'm not quite so sure. And that's the way it is. Because there has been a literalism which has permeated study of the Bible. And what it does is If you cannot believe the narratives that the Red Sea parted, that the wall of Jericho fell, that Jesus walked on water, that the sun stood still, that's all in there. If you cannot believe the literalism of that, where do you go? So given that, given the fact that he is trying to take these precious narratives and turn them into something that is relevant for all of us, what does he do with the resurrection story? The resurrection story being that this man literally, physically rose from the dead. Well, if you're not going to believe that, what are you left with? Do you have to throw the whole thing out? Or is there some way to redeem the narratives of this wonderful book into a way that remains relevant for all of us? To take the story of his resurrection and turn it into something that still speaks to those of us who don't think that the Red Sea necessarily parted or the sun stood still. Bishop Spong has explored what he calls the Easter moment extensively. And I got a lot of this talk out of his book, which is called The Easter Moment. And I recommend it to you. It's a wonderful book. I'd like to share some of his thoughts with you. It was a moment, in his view, that transformed our planet, that changed the arc of history. And it continues to change the history for us going forward. So, as a student of the Bible, Bishop Spong first notes that the story of the physically written Jesus, the physically risen Jesus, got more embellished as time went on. For those who were here on Friday at Reverend Sidney's wonderful Good Friday service, she noted that the first writer in the New Testament was who? Paul. It was Paul. It was not one of the Gospels. What we do is we tend to look at the Gospels, or we tend to look at Paul through the prism of the Gospels, but we've got it backwards. Paul wrote first. He wrote between 20 and 34 years after the crucifixion, and then they go through the Gospel writers to John, who wrote about 60 to 70 years following the crucifixion. Paul died several years before the first Gospel was even written, and his writings contain no story of a physical resurrection. It's not even mentioned in the writings of Paul, which are the soonest following the actual crucifixion. As the Gospels proceed from the first written, which is Mark, yes, through to John, the physicality of Jesus' resurrection, it actually becomes more pronounced. I mean, this is just the way humans work. You know, when you want a story to go, you just kind of make it more pronounced as you go. The original text of Mark was written about 40 years after the crucifixion. It ends without a risen Jesus actually being seen by anybody. Who here has read the original ending of Mark? It ends at verse 8. It ends at verse 8. And the last part of it is the women run from the tomb in fear because they've seen an angel there, but they don't see the risen Jesus. Verses 9 through 20, which do contain allegories of a written Jesus, they were written later. They are additions. And actually, later versions of the Bible don't even put them in the main text. They put them in the footnotes. So Mark, the first gospel written, contains no references to a risen Jesus. Then we get to Luke, which is written independently of Matthew. Matthew and Luke were risen about the same time. In Matthew is the first reference to a physically risen Jesus. And in Luke, which is written independently, that increases the physicality of the risen Jesus. In Luke, he eats, he drinks, he is touched, he is seen, he appears, he disappears. This is all new stuff. This is all stuff that came after. The conclusion of many scholars is that this physical resurrection was a later addition. That's fascinating. It was a later addition. So this leaves us with a bit of a problem. Bishop Spong's point is that you don't need to be a believer in the physical resurrection to grasp the importance of what he calls the Easter moment. In fact, if you are hanging your hat on the physical resurrection, you may be missing the point. He invites us to take a new look at the same event, which retains its deeper meaning, but with a new interpretation. So what he does is he tells it like a story, and he brings us to the moments after the crucifixion. And I'm going to ask you to imagine this with me. A small band of believers, their Messiah, their leader, has just been crucified, killed in the most humiliating way possible. They are broken, defeated, dispirited, and totally confused. The people of Judea had been looking, had been hoping for a Messiah who was going to rescue them from the Romans, remember? The Messiah. Jesus had just ridden into Jerusalem, proclaimed as the Messiah. Hosanna, here's the guy who's going to deliver us from occupation, from slavery, from fear, who's going to bring us into our nationhood. That's what people thought. What followed in his capture, in his trial, in his humiliating conviction was such a stupendous defeat for this vision that his followers were shaken, they were broken, and they were nearly disbanded. Just put yourself in that place. All your hopes are on this event. You know it's going to happen. You know it's going to happen with every fiber in your being. And then there's a guy on a cross. He's dead. And it's done. And he's a criminal. And where do you go next when dreams like that are just shattered? What do you do? So, this is where the Easter moment comes in. What happened? What happened that transformed these broken men in such a short time into the absolutely fearless and committed advocates that very shortly were going to stand up with no fear, with no hesitation, and take this message around the world as they know it? Something absolutely miraculous happened to make that message live into the message it is today, which sustains millions of human hearts around the globe. What happened? Something did. But it was not a physical resurrection. We know that. Because that wasn't written until later. But something got these guys going. And this is what we're going to talk about. Spong says, what happened to them is the same gift that we are offered now. And this is why every day is a resurrection day. It's the same awakening that we are offered now. As the disciples thought about it, as they contemplated his message, his teachings, and then his capture, and then his death, they began to understand what he actually had been saying, where they didn't understand it before. They had thought that he was there to deliver them as an earthly king, a new David, a son of David. But that was not his message at all. They thought it was, because that was their understanding of who the Messiah was. Don't we often do that? Don't we let our understandings get in the way of what it is we're actually seeing? Don't we sometimes miss the message because we think we know what it is? Well, they're very human, and that is what happened to them. So Bishop Spong places the Easter moment within the context of the breaking of bread following the crucifixion, the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine, within the context of communion, which is such a pivotal part of the Christian tradition, which is one reason it was so great that Reverend Sidney did that last Friday. It was such a meaningful event. As the remnants of the group gathered, they just got together in a room someplace, behind a closed door, to talk about what had happened, to figure out where to go next, to find out what had gone wrong. They remembered Jesus' instructions at the final meal that Thursday night to break bread, to drink wine, and to do it in remembrance of him. They had nothing else left. All they could do was follow these instructions. In his instruction to repeat this ritual, Spong writes that what Jesus had done was give them a clue, which would, in his words, unlock both the meaning and the power of his life and his message, so that they would not miss the point. He told them just to repeat that ritual, to see his life and his message, to see his life and his message in the symbols of the broken bread and the poured out wine. I mean, how many of us have taken communion, and I didn't know what it meant. I've done it countless times, but you don't know what it means. But reading this really gave it a whole new meaning for me, to see the symbols of his life in the broken bread and the poured out wine. So Spong thinks that Peter led the ceremony. There's going to be more about Peter later. But Peter always, if you read the biblical narrative, he always kind of put himself at the head, didn't he? He was always the first to answer the questions. He was always the one who knew. So Spong says, I bet Peter probably led this ceremony. So imagine these guys. They're in a room. The door is closed. They have just been connected to this criminal. They don't know that they're not being hunted. They're waiting for the knock on the door themselves. Are you in there? They don't know what's going to happen to them, but still they gather. And still they followed Jesus' last instructions to break the bread, to drink the wine, and to do it in remembrance of him. So imagine, Peter's breaking the bread. And then, that is the moment. That is the Easter moment. He stops. He is transfixed. He gets it. Haven't you ever had those moments where you just get it? In that Easter moment, his paradigm changed and his worldview changed. And he understood what Jesus had been saying. Jesus' message was that he was going to live out the meaning of the love of God in the face of every human distortion of that love. Think about that. He was going to live out the love of God in the face of every human distortion of that love. He absorbed abuse and he returned love. He absorbed hate and he returned forgiveness. He absorbed misunderstanding and he returned acceptance. He just took it all. He was betrayed and he loved the betrayer. He was denied and he loved the denier. He was abused and he responded with love. To the soldiers, he spoke the words of forgiveness. To the thief next to him, he spoke words of assurance. To his mother, he spoke words of caring. A dying man suspended from a cross, this is Spong again, lived out the freedom, the wholeness, the fullness of life that only one in touch with the meaning of God could possibly possess. Peter understood that the cross was the way that Jesus proclaimed to the world that there is nothing we can do and nothing we can be that separates us from the love of God. That was the meaning that he got right then in those broken symbols of the bread and the wine. There is nothing we can do and nothing we can be that separates us from the love of God. So, it matters that this epiphany, this aha moment, came to Peter, because Peter is the one who had 3 times denied God. Do you remember that story? Mm-hmm. Peter really had thought he was like the main guy. He's the rock. He's the one who's going to form the church. He thought he was just it. He had bluster, he had bravado, he was the guy with all the answers. And then at the end, he realized that he was nothing but a coward because he denied Jesus 3 times in his face. One of the gospel narratives even contains the image that Jesus turned around and looked at him. And what makes it worse was that the person who called Peter out was just a serving girl. You know, in the biblical, that was just the lowest of the low. It's like, oh my God, I mean, look who's calling me out. Look who is telling the world that I am an absolute, abject coward. But it didn't matter, because the message was exactly the same. It didn't matter. At that moment, at that Easter moment, that's when Peter realized that Jesus was not dead. His message was not dead. His consciousness was living, because that truth lived in him and it lives in each one of us. Aren't there moments when words are an insufficient medium to convey the power of a moment? Words then and words now are insufficient to convey the power of that realization hitting him full in the face of what Jesus had been teaching and saying and showing and finally died to show to Peter and to everyone there and to all the rest of us. As Bishop Spong points out, you can even read the text and see the biblical writers struggling with words just to convey the power of this moment. They just don't know how to do it. But you can see some of what they write. They write, there was darkness over the whole land. The veil in the temple was split from top to bottom. There was an earthquake. The massive stone before the tomb was miraculously rolled away. Think about this. They are just trying to convey the magnificence of what happened. The resurrection message was spoken by the lips of angels. Angels came. Suddenly he was in the midst of them. Suddenly there he was. Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended. All power is given to me in heaven and on earth. These are not literal things. What they're trying to do is just convey the enormity of the realization that they had all just had, the realization of the fact that had just happened. The only way to experience this Easter moment is not with words, is not to read about it, it's just to surrender yourself to the power of that event, because words will not do it. There is nothing we can do that separates us from God. No matter our limitations, our fears, our judgments, our despair, the stories we tell ourselves, that we are separate, we are not enough, we are too small, we have failed. We are lifted up in the truth of that Easter moment. We are of God. We are created by that Creator, that universal power, and there is nothing we can do, nothing we can be, which will change that, no matter how hard we try, because God knows we try, don't we? Nothing changes that truth. There is nothing that removes us from the power and the depth of the love that sustains us. Every day, no matter what our defeats, we are resurrected to the truth of that moment. That's the resurrection story that we celebrate today and every day. So, this carries a message of transformation, does it not? Yes, it carries a message of transformation. Jesus said, I came that you may have life and live it abundantly. Jesus does not want us to play small. We have life and we live it abundantly. The message is one of living fully in the knowledge of our connection. The fact that we are of source. I heard somebody say once, God is not in us like raisins are in raisin bread. God is in us like wet is in water. You can't separate them like wet is in water. We are just of God. There is no me and God. It is all one. It is my innate quality. It is your innate quality. Our old paradigms fall away as we just walk into the truth of who we really are. Our old truths have to die as we walk into this new life. The Easter message is an absolute game changer. It is not limited to one day. Every day, we have the chance to call upon that Christ consciousness to transform, to see our lives and the world around us in completely new lights. That is the Easter message. The resurrection is our power to overcome, to restore, to heal whatever in our life limits us. Can you feel the energy of that? I think we all should be like 6 inches above the floor. What a gift, what a moment, what a realization, and what power is right here. Chris talks about entities being in the room. That power is in this room and remains with you wherever you go. So, how do we open this gift? How do we take this message of transformation and apply it in our own lives? So what had to happen to Peter before he was able to realize the meaning of that Easter moment? Well, the first thing he had to do was let go, as we have to let go, to our old judgments, our old way of thinking, our old paradigms, our old way of seeing, our old way of believing what we believe the world to be. Peter had to let go of his vision of Jesus as the earthly Messiah. He also had to let go of his own ego, of his own vision of himself as leading, standing behind, or standing right next to Jesus. Peter thought it was no mistake that there were 12 disciples, because there were 12 tribes of Israel. So this lined up very neatly for him. He was going to be the earthly leader of this massive new legion of freed Israelites. He had to let that go, because he realized that even the enormity of that message was just playing small. He had to put it aside to make room for the larger truth of what he had just realized. It is significant that the renewal of Easter takes place after the events of Good Friday and Saturday. These are useful metaphors for us, and we need to just consider them. We know that every transformation into new life requires an ending, a release, a transition, and a beginning. Don't we know that to be true? Those are the metaphors that we're looking at today. And the elements of the Easter story, they give us the tools to work with those, as all good metaphors do. Good Friday gave us the death of Jesus, the end of old ways of thinking, old ways of doing. There are two types of death. One is terminal death, okay, death of the body. Life ceases to exist. The other one in the Christian tradition is called paschal death. That's P-A-S-C-H-A-L, paschal death. And what that means is the end of an old life, but only to make way for a newer and a richer one. It is the death of the old to make way for the rich and the wonderful new. That is what we are celebrating in the sequence between Good Friday and now. Reverend Sidney, when she was giving her Good Friday service, she began with a quote from John 12:24, and I want to read it here because it conveys this idea. This is what it says. "Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Think about that. Think of a wheat stalk. If there is a grain on it and it doesn't fall and germinate new life, what's going to happen? It remains a single grain. But when it dies, it falls into the earth and it is transformed. It becomes abundant new life. That's the message that Jesus was giving by his death. Our old ideas have to die to begin the process of transformation. So, after the endings of Good Friday, what happens? We have Saturday. We have Saturday in the tomb. Now, we might think of the tomb as a time of death, as a time of despair, but it's not. What happens during the winter? When you look out at a field and you think, well, nothing's happened there. Look lower. Everything is happening. Germination, life, preparation. The tomb, metaphysically, is not a place of death. It's a place of rest, a place of accessing higher consciousness in preparation for a transformation into new understanding and new life. Germination of the seed. The caterpillar turns into a butterfly, but it takes a moment. There's that time of transition, and we need that time too as we're going from death to new life. Then comes the awakening of Easter. The rebirth, the renewal that we experience when we step fully into the consciousness of ourselves as the expression of God here on earth. Sometimes we just have to let things go before we can realize that, as Peter did. Before we can step into the knowledge that we have a mission, we have a role, we have a light shining in us that makes us the expression of God on earth. Free to love without limitations, free to awaken, free to use our gifts to heal ourselves and our world. So, the Easter story invites us to ask. We need to each ask ourselves, what are the transformations that are happening in our lives? What paradigms in your life need to change so that there can be new growth and new life? What old understandings have to be shed for you so that new ones can step into their place? Taking a larger view, what new understandings need to be considered as we look at our world, as we listen to news of war, to news of terror? I know we're all aware of what happened in Brussels last week. To news of hunger, of deprivation, of pain, of displacement, of fear. As we look at all the problems that are in our world, is there a place where the renewing power of love can make a difference? Is there a place where we can make a difference as the expressions of that resurrection love in the world? I believe there are. And I believe that it is our privilege to go out in the world and do that, as we were taught to do, as we are inspired to do. That's why we are given the gifts that we are given. Is there a place where our gifts can make a difference? Well, the answer is yes. The resurrection story tells us that nothing in our world, or nothing in ourselves, limits the love of God to heal and to make whole if we will step forward in that knowledge. Nothing. Our challenge is to put aside our fears, put aside our hesitations, put aside our excuses, and realize in the here and the now that as emissaries of this love, we will make a difference. the Easter moment teaches us that we are heirs to abundance, to power, and transcendence. As Jesus taught, we can use these gifts to heal, to teach, to make our world truly a place that reflects the love that created it. Let's take these thoughts.